Welcome everyone to Twitter Spaces with Bluejay. We do these educational Twitter Spaces on a weekly basis where we speak with other protocols in the space, introduce them to our community, and learn more about them. And today we have LandX Finance, and Len Walker is speaking on behalf of them using their account. And we'll learn more about bringing agricultural commodities, perpetuals on chain. And welcome LandX and Land Walker. Kindly introduce yourself and also briefly on what LandX Finance does.
Sure. Thank you, Bluejay. LandX is a perpetual commodities vault protocol. We are a real world asset project. We bring yield from real farmlands on chain and make it available to the DeFi investors in the form of what we call X tokens. We work with 4 commodity types: corn, wheat, soy, and rice. And the investors on chain can invest in these token vaults and receive their yield denominated in the commodities. So instead of receiving yield in the tokens of some inflationary emissions, you're receiving yield which is nominated in commodity tokens, but it's exchangeable at the commodity price at the treasury. So where does this yield come from? We extend the finance, we extend the ability to mint these X tokens to the farmers around the world. And farmers are basically the ones that are providing this financial instrument to you. Platform LandX just organizes the whole process. So we're decentralized protocols. So our smart contracts are looking after the rental foundation, the distribution of fees. We have a governance token, etc. So in essence, we're tokenizing farmland derivatives or the farmland crop share. Farmers promise to pay a certain amount of the future harvest to the platform. In exchange, they get a whole bunch of these X tokens that they can then sell to investors. How is that secured? It's secured by farmland. So if the farmer doesn't pay his crop share, the collateral that he uses to put these X tokens on the market is his farmland. So basically, he's going to lose the farmland if he doesn't pay that crop share. So investors that are investing in these X tokens are receiving yield, which is basically streamed over to them from the treasury. And this yield is, as I said, denominated in units of commodity. So in kilograms of corn, rice, soy, or wheat. And they can accumulate these kilograms or they can exchange them for stable coins at the treasury at the current market price of the commodities. So what problem do we solve by doing that? There's actually 2 real world problems that we're solving. One is that the farmers around the world, in majority of the cases, don't have access to the finance. Why? Because they're too small or because they're placed in countries where the finance is either prohibitive or highly exploited. Let's say they're in a country which has a high inflation rate. So their interest that they would have to pay will be double digit. It will be denominated in a local currency. They're growing an internationally tradable crop, let's say soybeans, and they have a forex exposure and they have the commodity exposure, and they're a small farmer. So these loans for them are actually very financially dangerous. LandX provides them with the ability to have a fixed amount of the future harvest as a commitment that they pay to the holders of these X tokens. So the farmer knows exactly what his obligation is every year. And if he grows, let's say 4 tons of corn, and he knows that he needs to pay 300 kilograms of corn every year, which would amount to, I don't know, let's say 8-9% of his harvest. He knows that that's the percent of the harvest that he knows that he has to pay now every year to basically service his loan. If he wants to close that loan off, he then has to go back to the market and buy these X tokens off the market, and then he can close off his obligation. So this way, he has access to the finance that's being brought over to him from DeFi space. And it's very flexible. It's very easy to understand for him from a point of view of risks. And so it doesn't have a duration. So he can do it as long or as little as he wants, which makes this instrument very interesting for the farmer. For investor, it's also a very interesting use case because investor has currently literally no ability to expose his on-chain assets to anything that isn't correlated with the price of Bitcoin. So investors may as well, and you can see at the Bitcoin market cap dominance and Ethereum. So I'm not sure Bitcoin, Ethereum would make up probably more than 50% of the market cap now. So if these two assets, and they move absolutely in sync, are basically the assets that are moving the whole market. So investors would want to have some exposure to an asset that isn't moving the same way, that has a completely different sort of price formation mechanics. And X token is the commodity vault. Basically, it's a perpetual commodity vault instrument that shouldn't be that much affected by the price movement of the Bitcoin, because it's not in any shape or form connected neither to the US dollar, not to Bitcoin. It's just connected to the price of the food and food security narrative. And as we all know, food is not going to be cheaper anytime soon. We have a growing population. We have an energy crisis. The fertilizers are more expensive. There's global warming. And all these factors are playing into the formation of the prices for food. The global food price index is now all-time high. And there's a lot of systemic issues in the agro sector that are probably not going to be resolved anytime soon. And all of these factors are playing into the quite a high appreciation of the prices for food. So investors on DeFi with X token now have an instrument that they can allocate part of their investment portfolio that is yield bearing, produces yield, and is not correlated with the price of the other crypto assets or stocks.
Yeah, lovely, lovely. Yeah, great to know you guys are bringing agricultural commodities, perpetuals on chain. Like you mentioned, it's not correlated with the crypto markets, which is really good right now because, yeah, bear market is hitting everyone. Everything's correlated with ETH and BTC. Having something that is on chain and isn't correlated and able to produce a decent use, yeah, that's definitely a breath of fresh air for everyone here. So I guess, like you mentioned, agricultural commodities are necessary. Like wheat is staple, and we always need food. So demand for it is always high, and with the current supply chain crisis, food shortage in certain regions, there's strong price action in terms of agricultural products. But yeah, elaborating on that, what kind of use do we get to see with these agricultural commodity perpetuals? And also, yeah, I guess since it's going to appreciate gradually and decently over time, I guess what can we expect in terms of the yield that we are receiving? Will it continue to increase through LandX Finance?
There's a couple of very interesting use cases that are coming up, which are formed on the basis of decoupling of the food supply chains and the monetary financial instruments like US dollar, for example. With X tokens that pay yield in C tokens, and the C token being basically a commodity token that equals to 1 kilogram of commodity. And that's how you collect in the yield. So let's say you have 100,000 X tokens that you're staking. So now every year you're receiving 100,000 C tokens. If you're a consumer of this commodity, let's say a chicken farm that is requiring every year a supply of corn, for example, to feed the chicken, and you're somewhere in the north of Spain, every year you have a problem of actually accessing physical commodity, because the commodity markets are sellers' markets usually. So that hunt for the physical commodity is every year problem for everybody who is involved with the consuming of these actual physical commodities. So by staking X token, you are pretty much guaranteed receipt of the C token yield. And we're working on a case where the C token will be accepted as a medium of payment in silos that are storing these commodities. So instead of going fiat, buying the commodity, you basically buying the X tokens, receiving C token yield, and then exchanging that C token at the silo for the commodity that you use. And I think it's a fascinating use case that we're definitely going to be expanding on, because it brings a completely different dynamic in the whole sort of agricultural ecosystem. For investors currently off-chain, there is an ability to expose the portfolio to the price action of the commodity markets. And these are multi-trillion dollar markets. You can buy futures, you can buy options, you can trade in the commodities market like anyone else. But it doesn't give you access to yield. So you're basically speculating on the price dynamic of the commodities, and it's quite an efficient market. So the volatility there is not very high. The volumes are very big. And if you're not a professional big trader, then probably the commodities market is not something that would you look at as your first choice of. But if you're an investor, then realistically, the only way currently how you can invest into farmland is to actually go and buy a block of land somewhere. And that is associated with the benefits, but also problems, because you need to firstly outlay a significant amount of money. You need to know where that farmland is. You need to rent that farmland out. You need to collect rent. You need to pay taxes. You need to administer all the legal requirements around foreign land ownership, for example, if that's, that land is located somewhere outside of the country where you live. So there's a lot of real sort of complexities associated with investment into the farmland. But farmland itself, if you're investing in farmland as an asset class, then you're pretty much hedging against long-term inflation effect. And with the view that the farmland being an asset class that's not growing in supply, the demand for farmland products is growing because the population grows, etc. So it's a very good sort of trade, but this trade is available to ultra high net worth individuals that are Bill Gates and the like are investing in farmlands, and they're probably the biggest landowners now. As a kind of normal person investor without access to billions of dollars, you don't really have too many options of exposing your portfolio to farmland unless you're locking yourself into real estate investment trust that is basically creating a managed financial investment for you. You're obviously paying fees, etc. So it's an option and people do that. But I think that X token provides a more liquid and more fluid option to that exposure to the farmland derivative through this perpetual commodity vault. It makes more sense because it's liquid, it's 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year tradable. You always get price discovery on it. So you know exactly where you are. You can take it off chain. You can provide it as liquidity. We're working now on a very interesting case where X tokens will be provided so if X tokens are provided as liquidity in liquidity pools, that they will be incentivized with yield. So you're not going to lose your yield because you're providing your X tokens into liquidity pools. And I think this is a fascinating example of how the farmer theoretically could use his farmland without literally losing anything, but he can provide his farmland as an asset, which he digitizes through X token and provides as a liquidity, because he's going to pay rent or crop share obligation, but because he's collecting that crop share obligation himself, he hasn't sold the tokens, he owns the tokens. So he basically collects his own rent while providing liquidity into the liquidity pool for other farmers to sell their X tokens into, for example. So there's a lot of use cases that we see will now be emerging around the X tokens as well as the C tokens, because the C token being a very stable token connected to the price of the commodity. So one C token is basically 1 kilogram of commodity. You can use that C token as a collateral on your DeFi, basically a Lego block that you can take somewhere else and then borrow against it if you need to have exposure to a more volatile asset. So the C token will be less volatile, definitely, than Ethereum, and Ethereum being one of the most sort of common collaterals in the DeFi space, I think loses in that sense to the C token, because the C token has a lot less volatility, and you do want to provide your collateral when you have less volatility of your sort of base asset. We obviously are excited launching these products and seeing what other builders and the DeFi community will start creating for them. But also one thing that I should mention is that these could be used as basically base assets to borrow. And I think with Bluejay, we need to start having conversation about farmers being able to use their X token or C tokens to then basically mint their local currencies. And I think that's a very interesting use case for the farmers as well, for LandX, where basically a farmland backed asset with low volatility is going to be used to produce something that the farmers can use in real world. So it's going to be very exciting if we're going to start, guys, this conversation going. So we're definitely open to.
Yeah, I really love what you guys are doing. But yeah, basically, like you mentioned earlier, rich people are able to access these farmlands while retail investors like ourselves can't. And you guys are democratizing the access to that. So something like CityDAO, where people are able to own parts of land purely because they are part of the DAO or they own a certain token. Yeah, I see that as being very revolutionary, and yeah, grateful that you guys are building that as well. Very forward thinking. And yeah, touching on, you mentioned a lot about having land as collateral. Maybe you can elaborate more on that with regards to which is there a specific region of land you guys are currently targeting, and like the types of farmers you guys are targeting. What's the yield rate? What's the APY on having these C tokens?
Okay. It probably will take a step back a little bit and have a look at the macro farmland distribution of the farmers versus their output. So about 60% of the global farmers are producing about 80% of the food that we consume. And these farmers are all small to mid-hold farmers that have less than 50 hectares of farmland. So we're dealing with literally hundreds of thousands of or millions of farmers that are basically forming this massive ecosystem of agricultural supply chain that is in a lot of parts disconnected from the financial rails that would drive the financial liquidity into this industry. When we're looking at our targets for LandX, of course, we want to make sure that we are not exposing ourselves to excessive risks of where there is no rule of law, for example, where these lien agreements that we make in place to collateralize this crop share obligation are not going to be enforceable. So we have to operate within the jurisdictions where things like mortgages, where things like using land as a collateral for some obligation would be legally enforceable. Now, thankfully, that is probably about, I'd say, probably 50 to 60% of the world has ability to provide that legal foundation. Definitely, land is not valued the same around the world, and the price of land is very much disconnected from its productive ability. So a similar land in two different countries, but the land that's producing a similar amount of harvest, maybe 4 or 5x difference in price. And that inefficiency is creating a lot of opportunities for LandX, because if we're looking at a country, for example, like Bulgaria, where the price of the farmland is a lot cheaper than a similar price, a similar productive land somewhere in Germany, for example, which is not far away. But in Bulgaria, farmers don't have access to the financing because of the stringent requirements that the banks are putting in place, because of the way the whole sort of financial ecosystem evolved there, because they have their local lev currency that makes things a lot more difficult from point of view of tapping into the global or broader European Union financial structures. They're pretty much cut off from the financial credit. And that's a very interesting location for us, because I guess it's one example where you have a very valuable asset in the rule of law jurisdiction without established financial ecosystem around it. And all these factors are playing into very strong narrative for us to work extensively in Bulgaria to create the system where the validators would be able to work with LandX. So validators, if you guys don't know, are the entities that are bridging this relationship between the platform, between the decentralized LandX protocol and the farmer itself. So they take on responsibility of onboarding the farmers, vetting the farmland, and a lot of other things, as well as managing this mechanics of the transaction from fiat into currency, into crypto, and back and crop shares and whatnot. So I guess our focus is based on certain criterias where we are able to establish that there's a strong legal case for the land being used as a collateral for an obligation to pay crop share, which is enforceable in court. And that's one. And it's the primary requirement that we need to look at. And that's why I guess we're not going to be in place like Central African Republic, where the land is very cheap, but there's no legal framework for us to operate there. So Europe, Eastern Europe, the EU countries that have probably somewhat underdeveloped financial structures. The countries outside of EU, like Serbia, for example, is very interesting. Turkey is a tremendously interesting country. Georgia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Bulgaria, as I said, Romania. Poland is a more difficult case because of their very specific land restrictions and regulations that they have. as well as France is difficult, India is difficult. So I guess it's all very specific, but there are places where the sort of macro and the financial conditions are suitable for LandX to be going first. And as I said, firstly, we have to make sure that there's a very strong legal framework that allows us to ties our right if the farmer doesn't keep his obligation. And that protection that investors will have is very important for the health of the whole protocol, of course. And secondly, I guess from a farmer's point of view, there has to be somewhat a connected dependency between how much money he gets for his crop share obligation versus the value of the collateral of his land. So in places like Netherlands, I would imagine, we haven't really went there, but I would imagine that if land is tremendously expensive, let's say reaching 40,000 euro per hectare, and then the crop share obligation that we would allow the farmer to tokenize would be somewhat similar to the one in Bulgaria, he's not going to get more X tokens for his obligation in Netherlands. So he would have to use his higher collateral to put under a smaller obligation. So in some cases, probably with the presence of other financing options in these countries, it would probably not make as much sense, but we don't know that yet. So we're going to try and see whether UK, Netherlands, Germany would be also the markets where we can offer that. So we're obviously actively looking for validators around the world and building a system that we can scale. So yeah.
Okay, so with these validators, you guys are able to navigate the different legal landscapes across the different regions to provide financing to the land across all the regions you mentioned. And yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess, yeah, for the validators you mentioned, what's their background? Is there any certain qualification they need? And how do they educate these farmers on the, I guess, crypto onboarding and all that? How do they understand all these
Yeah.
complexities?
Yeah. So there's a couple of scenarios really that are very possible and feasible, and the ones that we're working through at the moment. And literally every kind of location, every jurisdiction has its own flavor because that would heavily depend on who the validator is and what his strength is. I'll give you a couple of examples. Won't name the countries, but I'll give you examples that are very interesting. So a country that has farmers that are that do not have a level of financial sophistication, but are united into cooperatives, basically being very smallhold farmers, having 2 to 10 hectares, and absolutely no capability to negotiate, manage the input prices, negotiate with equipment vendors, or in any shape or form operate their finances. So basically, they own the land, but they're in poverty because they've been ripped apart by everybody who is around this whole ecosystem. So in this country, there's an NGO, which is a nonprofit organization that is connected to the Ministry of Agriculture that has a goal of lifting these farmers from a poverty by providing them with access to finance. But finance will come through LandX to this NGO. The finance will be backed by the farmland ownership the same way, but it will be a managed situation where this NGO will basically act as a finance manager for all these farmers. And that's a very interesting use case where the farmer doesn't really need to know blockchain or understand wallets and whatnot. So this NGO with the power of attorney from the farmers will be able to size their kind of duty in the best interest of the farmers. And LandX investors would have the same level of protection because the farmland will be secured, or these loans will be secured by the farmland. So this is a fascinating use case, I think, because that sort of bridges that educational divide between the level at which the farmers are and between the necessity to access to these financial instruments through a managed basically solution, a third party managed solution. And I really like that's a nonprofit organization because it has a strong social mandate, and it will pay its own expenses because validators are rewarded for what they do, the fees that the platform generates, but they will not be predatory in the sense that other financial institutions will be. So we'll see how this use case will develop. The other use case is in another country where the validator is basically a financial intermediary. So it's a licensed financial service provider that has a capability of operating in the crypto markets and extending financial credits to farmers, to anybody else. So they have a financial license. So the deal with them is that they basically act as a provider of the finance, but they go to LandX for the source of this finance. So we basically collect the finance through the placements of these NFTs and DEX tokens on the market, deliver the funds to this financial organization, the validator, who then delivers that to the farmers. And the farmers really do not see the whole blockchain back end of this whole operation. What they see is that they have an obligation to pay crop share denominated in the kilograms of their harvest every year, and they get a big lump sum upfront payment that they can use to improve their production. So the whole blockchain side of things is not really visible to them, and which is another very interesting use case, which also eliminates the necessity to have the farmers individually manage their X tokens and self custody. We have the cases where the farmers are actually interested in doing that as well. So they're interested in acting as self custodian holders of the X tokens and participating in the markets. And so there's a whole variety of different use cases. And we'll probably be observing a situation where there's going to be probably several main kind of scenarios evolving over time. And it will take some time before the farmers at large will be able to operate independently on the platform. And in which case the validator would basically be an onboarding agent. So they would not have to perform any functions for them. But in some cases, the validator is basically a trusted entity with a power of attorney from a farmer to perform all these crypto operations with the tokens, sell them, transfer to fiat money, etc.
Yeah, I like that. It's an easier onboarding process where the farmer doesn't need to go through that huge learning curve and understand how crypto works to access more liquidity and I guess earn a bit more with their land. And yeah, you're also giving the option for those who do want to custody their own tokens. So that's great. Yeah, it should be a matter of choice, actually, a freedom of choice where they can choose either to custody it themselves or yeah, if they choose not to. Yeah, a bit more on the types of crops you guys are adopting. So I understand it's wheat, soy, and two others. I guess how do you guys come about deciding these are the type of crops you guys will adopt, and what other types of crops will you guys bring on chain down the road?
We thought that perhaps we're going to initially go very broad and go into palm oil and to the Arabica coffee and gardens and orchards and whatnot. But if you look at the fundamentals of the model that we do, we're not really exposing the investor to the business side of the operation. So if you have a vineyard, for example, that you want to tokenize, then the bulk of the value is created by the vineyard, not by the land upon this vineyard is built. And that's a situation that kind of skews a little bit economic risks of the investor and the operator. So suddenly investor becomes exposed to the business side of the vineyard operator too much. And it's the same with the coffee plantation where the coffee tree would grow for 50 years, but then what happens after that? And the coffee trees have to be replenished. And then when you're buying into a coffee plantation, you don't know how many trees are old, how many of them are new, when they have to be exposed. So risk profile changes dramatically from when you're dealing with cash crops. So cash crops are annual crops that you basically plant each year and you harvest each year. And they could have crop rotation. So it doesn't mean that every year you're doing corn. So you could do corn, wheat, sunflower, corn, wheat, sunflower again. But then you're basically choosing, and we chose 4 main crops that most of the farmlands that are producing cash crops are planting. Whether they're doing something else in between doesn't really matter, because one of the major crops that they would do all the time would be either rice, corn, soybeans, or wheat. And so they could do wheat, corn, and maybe something else, and maybe potatoes the third year or beetroot every 5 years. But their main crop still would be, so their land basically will be collateralized for the obligation to pay the crop share in one crop. And this one crop has to be one of these 4 major crops. soy, wheat, rice, or corn. But it doesn't mean that these are the crops that they only farm, because they can farm whatever they want to farm, so long as they keep their obligation paid out in value of the crop that they have their obligation in. So just to make it simple, if you have, like, if you're a farmer and your obligation is to pay 400 kilograms of wheat per hectare, and you decide to plant, for example, corn that year, that's fine. But your obligation to pay will still be expressed in the kilograms of wheat. So you have to sell the corn, get the money, calculate how much money in wheat prices you would have to pay, and pay this obligation to the platform. So in a way, it's a hedge as well. So farmers that have to choose between planting wheat or corn, they could plant corn, but then have their obligation denominated in wheat. And that means that they can have the X tokens sold as if it was wheat while they're planting the corn, which also limits their risk exposure to this price differential between the various crops. So there's a lot of interesting use cases that are coming about as we speak to farmers, as we speak to investors as well. And we probably are yet to learn about all the possibilities that will be emerging from that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And yeah, it can be a hedge if you are planting one crop and then nominating it in another. It's really interesting. I never really thought about that, and that's a new function and potentially good for farmers who wants to hedge their risks against a specific type of crop. Yeah, other than that, I guess more towards the business development side. How does LandX find the farmers who are willing to work with them to tokenize their crops and land? The validators, the ones out there going to the farmers asking on the ground, or is there other ways which you guys reach out to them?
So we got very lucky because our seed investors into LandX protocol are large European farmland owners. And the investment deal that LandX platform has with these investors is that they provide the capital for platform development, as well as commitment of up to 50,000 hectares of farmland that we can onboard. So our pipeline currently probably can be valued at about 300 million US dollars of different farmlands that we can bring on board to the LandX. And that's not obviously the target that we have. We want to get to 1 million hectares in 5 years. And to get to that number, given that the farmland holders, what the farmland owners are, a lot of them are smallhold farmers, you would probably estimate an average farmland size of about 30 hectares. And for us to get to 1 million hectares, we need to onboard over 30,000 farmers around the world. So that is not something that we can do inside LandX protocol staff or operations. So we need to build a very extensive validator network. So our focus is now building a broad and very widely distributed validator network that will be the ones that reaching out to the farmers and working with them individually and having that exposure to the farmers around the world. And we've got these programs running in Africa, like Southeast Asia, Europe, of course. So we constantly are on the lookout for validators. So I think I didn't ask you a previous question of what the requirements for validators are, and I think it's a very important one. What we find is that it's probably impossible to become an effective validator if you don't understand DeFi. We had a couple of not very successful attempts on working with people with very strong agricultural background, and we thought that we can bring that knowledge of blockchain instruments to them. And because they have that strong agricultural background, that's probably going to be very helpful. We were wrong. It's a lot more difficult to teach blockchain to an agro professional than to teach agro to a blockchain professional. The agricultural and farmland business is not very complicated. Blockchain is. Our definitely priority is to work with people that have exposure and understanding of the DeFi instruments. They understand what a token is, they understand what yield is, what a liquidity pool is, they understand what is a trade, how do you exchange one token for another, how can you onboard from fiat into crypto. So these basic things, they don't have to be experts in DeFi yield farming, but certainly they do have to have an understanding of the yield generation instruments and vaults and things like that. We shifted our approach from trying to work with people who have very strong agro backgrounds to actually trying to find people who have relatively strong crypto backgrounds and then have exposure to agricultural sector. And we're finding these people. So surprisingly, when we having these outreaches and we're having these AMA sessions, we're finding people are coming out from a community as well. So we have quite a vibrant community on Discord, and you folks are listening, and maybe you're from the countries where you have access to farmlands or farmers or somebody who might be, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how, with the word of mouth, at the moment, we have over 20 applications that we're looking at and about 6 or 7 different validators that we are actively onboarded through also grants programs. So we offer grants for the validators to explore the possibilities in the local market. So we don't have them work for free for us, of course. And before the programs are established, we make sure that the validators are funded for the work that they do as well. I think that going this way, which is very interesting, that actually blockchain and DeFi is probably a lot more difficult concept to grasp and understand. So you guys that are in the space, and we all are pretty special in a way that we have access to this knowledge that most of the people around simply do not have. And I think what we need to do is not to, it's a good idea to try to explain the blockchain to as many people as possible, but it's becoming harder to do with the kind of narrative that is now surrounding the blockchain space. So I think the focus should be in creating solutions for real people that have the blockchain instruments behind. And you don't need to know now. 30 years ago, you had to understand what's under the bonnet of a car if you want to have a car. So you would understand how to change the brake pads, how to change the oil, etc. Now you don't. You just go to a service station whenever the kind of onboard computer tells you to. And that, I think that's the modality that needs to evolve around the blockchain solutions, that people do not really need to understand that's blockchain behind it. And I think if that happens, then the proliferation of the tools and financial instruments will be so much faster and better than try to now onboard individuals into X's or sexes or make sure that they self-custody, not self-custody, etc. Okay, it's important. But I think the B2B use cases are so much easier to build, and they're so much more impactful. So if you take LandX, for example, you imagine that we've onboarded 1 million hectares of farmers around the world. We are suddenly making dramatic impact in the whole agricultural food supply chain by delivering liquidity to places where that liquidity was not available. We're equalizing prices of the farmland. We're connecting the prices of the farmland to productive ability of that farmland. We're empowering the farmers around the world to be, empowering these farmers not to be impoverished members of the farming tree, but to be prosperous, inventive, industrious, and looking at various solutions, how to become more ecologically and climate positive, et cetera, et cetera. So liquidity does a lot of things. Liquidity solves a lot of problems. So these B2B solutions, where they're delivered through partnership between various participants in the supply chain, where the end user might not even understand that's a blockchain enabled solution. I think that's a fascinating area that we're very keen on exploring.
Yeah, it is. And yeah, like you mentioned, you in the past you need to understand how a car works to own one. And now it's much like how this is the way to onboard the next billion users to crypto. When yeah, we just remove all the complexities and allow them direct access to use instead of having to understand the custody, their own wallets, having to remember seed phrases and all that. Yeah, you
Right.
really really appreciate that as well with how you're working with your validators. And yeah, like you mentioned, it's more of word of mouth that you guys meet your validators so far, and also your seed investors also help with connecting with the farmers. I guess for a typical, like, for the audience here, if they want to be validators, is there a place on your website where they can click to register, or yeah, how does that go about?
Let me check. I think there is, but let me just make sure that there is.
Yeah, sure. Other than that, yeah, I understand you guys are launching your testnet soon.
Yeah.
Yeah. And more about
Right.
that.
So there is a request to become a farmer, but we probably, excuse me, we're probably going to put a request for validators as well. But the validators get onto our Discord server and they raise a ticket and say, look, I'm from Peru, I'm from Guatemala, I'm from Dominican Republic. What can you send me? And then we have a pretty straight process of how the process goes and the kind of things that we're jointly going through. So it's a very smooth and easy to understand onboarding process for validators. We had our testnet live for the last 8 weeks, and we have basically ran it in various scenarios and conditions on the Gurley testnet. And it was probably the first kind of step to making sure that the platform actually works well. So we've refined smart contracts. We've done a lot of changes in these 8 weeks of the testnet, of the first leg of the testnet. And we have now we have the smart contracts audited by QuantStamp. And these contracts will be deployed. The audited versions of smart contracts will be deployed on the final leg of the testnet that starts in 5 days on the 5th of December. And the last leg of the testnet that starts on the 5th of December will have the full capability and the full functionality of the live net, including the governance token, including the token mint for the LandX governance token, all the obviously X tokens, onboarding of the farmlands, et cetera, et cetera. So all the things that you will see in the live protocol will be on display in the final, we call it dress rehearsal testnet, that starts on the 5th of December. And there will be a trading competition. We had one in the previous testnet as well. We slightly changed the rules, but there's got to be some good prizes won and lots of very, very different incentives. I guess the idea is to get as many people to familiarize themselves with the working of the protocol and to understand how, it's not very complicated, but still to get their head around the X token staking, C token staking, provisioning of liquidity into liquidity pools. There will be the X basket, which is an index fund token that kind of gives you equal exposure to all 4 different X tokens and self-compounds and grows by itself, where you don't really need to do anything with it. So there's a lot of different things there. And this final leg of the testnet, as I said, will be launched on the 5th of December. And obviously the participants of this testnet and active members of the community will have, once we go to the token launch in the first few months of the new year, we'll obviously have higher possibility to be allocated at the TGE event, the LNDX governance tokens that we will have a very small public round for.
Nice, nice. And yeah, other than that, for the testnet, is there any incentive for the users at the end, any form of airdrop of
Right.
tokens? I'm just curious.
We're not fans of airdropping because airdrop sort of creates this sort of false,
Same. Agreed.
very false. Yeah. Okay. This is airdrop. So if I get an airdrop, I go and sell it straight away. That's not what we're looking for. We're not looking for people to get airdrop, but we're looking for people who can be part of the ecosystem, participate in trading, in investing in various aspects of the protocol. And then these people will be rewarded with, I'm not going to say with what, but there's going to be obviously a lot of advantages that these people will have before the protocol goes to the TGE stage. And so we have 2 basic levels of participation in the protocol, which is the whitelist for public. Then there is Alpha Farmer. Alpha Farmer is a member of the DAO. He fills an application form. He gets airdropped a certain amount of USDC for our test, Gurley USDC and also Gurley ETH. And then he can trade and buy, stake, sell, etc. If he then participates in various activities that we have on the protocol in forms of bounties and other things that you need to keep an eye on the announcements on Discord, then you can progress to a mega farmer. And the mega farmers so they'll get a higher allocation at the TG event and have a bigger exposure because they have a bigger sort of understanding of the protocol and they have contributed more to it. So that's probably the model that we're looking to do rather than airdropping. I'm not ruling out an airdrop as something. We haven't really made a decision on that. I'm just sharing my personal sentiment, but obviously it will be a team's decision and we'll consult with various members of the community and our ecosystem investors as well what we think would be the best option to make a successful launch. Of course, we want to make sure that we have enough exposure, and obviously airdrop gives you that. So you can buy a lot of exposure, and with exposure, you can actually buy quality as well. So there's an argument for airdrops as well. So keep an eye, guys, on our announcements and see what the ultimate decision will be, but it will be something and it will be a launch.
Yeah, but I like the idea of tiering your users based on the amount of activities they participate on the protocol to get TG allocation. That's really innovative, and yeah, it's a good way to reward those who really participate on the protocol and spend more time on it. And yeah, that's good information for our audience as well, if they're interested to get more allocation for the TG when it comes about. And yeah, testnet is launching soon. And yeah, if you guys do have time, go ahead and go over to LandX, Linktree, and join the Discord. And yeah, get
Sure, guys. Look, I'll just share my personal experience. I farm on testnet. So I actually buy X tokens and sell them and farm. I receive C token yield. I really like it. It's good fun. It's a completely different feeling. What you're getting is grounds you, and it's not like you understand that although you're in the DeFi space, I know the whole sort of system behind it. So I know that yield's coming from real farmers that are growing crops somewhere, and that I can imagine how that crop ends up on chain, but that's good. That's good. That's a different kind of yield farming that you do. I farmed a lot in the DeFi summer. I farmed, I think, everywhere I could have farmed, but this beats it just by the fact that what you're getting is corn or wheat or soy, and then you can trade it and you look for prices, and then you're like, oh, good, you know? So it's actually good fun. Besides being, I think, a very potent financial diversification instrument. And one of the areas that LandX is going to be working on, to also keep an eye on that, is to bridge this big divide between the NFT community and the DeFi community that I think exists now, where the way I see it is that the DeFi are all math and science graduates and kind of understand the finance very well. And the NFT guys are all about other things, culture and hype and vibes.
Yeah, community.
Whatnot. Yeah. So I think that I'm pitching that to a group of very kind of influential NFT holders. We don't want to incubate it within the community, but we certainly are seeing a use case where the X basket would be used as a ground foundation for a wrapper, for an NFT wrapper around it, which would guarantee the NFT not to drop below a certain price. Because the moment that NFT drops, floor price drops below the value of X baskets, then you can liquidate this NFT and get X baskets out. So you guarantee the price, basically. And I think that floor price of NFTs is a big issue. So if we can merge these two things together, excuse me, I think it's going to be a pretty exciting NFT project. So keep an eye on it. We call it Harvest Tour. Harvest Tour, we've launched the meme. We're just observing how that meme goes. I think it's pretty cool. So there's a character called Harvest Tour that is basically this chill Chad who is not really worried about the price of Bitcoin. He checks coin market cap 3 times a month, sleeps 11 hours a day. He collects yield. He's a big XOI maxi, and he's a very chill and very cool investor that has this good exposure to farmland, and it provides them, I made it to feel. So I think it's a pretty cool project. So we'll see how far we can take it, or somebody else will maybe want to help to take it with us. So we certainly are exploring many different ways to reach out to as many remaining participants of the Web3 space and DeFi space and NFT space that are still out there in the trenches, hoping to build a better world. I think that's very important to not now be having too many illusions about a lot of TradFi money pouring into the industry over the next year and stuff like that. So we need to build better products. We need to build better solutions. We need to build better systems. We need to build more transparency in the space. And then when we've done all that, when we actually manage to connect the dots ourselves, then I think the sky's the limit of what blockchain and Web3 solutions can do. But ultimately, the way we look at it is that the Web3 solution has to solve a real world problem somehow. There has to be a problem that it solves. And if it's not solving a problem, then probably it has a very limited sort of economic viability. Anyway, that's off topic, but I think it's relevant.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And thanks again, LandX and Len Walker, for having this session with us.
No worries. And thank you, Bluejay. And guys, if maybe I can ask you to say a few words about Bluejay, because there's a few members of the community that I can see that are coming from LandX that would also love to learn. I love what you do. So personally, I think that we should definitely have a chat about partnering more in the Southeast Asian space because of the uniqueness of the products that you're doing. So if you can maybe share what you do just in a few words to some of the guys that are coming in from the LandX ecosystem into that Twitter spaces, or who will maybe listening to that session when it's recorded.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So Bluejay is a stablecoin protocol focused on currencies denominated in Southeast Asia. So currently, today, we just launched our Blue SGD, and we'll be working towards launching the other currencies within Southeast Asia. A bit of better understanding as to why we do stablecoins for Southeast Asia is because 99% of the stablecoin market cap is currently denominated in USD. So there's little representation for those throughout the world. And especially for, I guess, on and off ramps for the region, yeah, it's a lot easier. You're already using a stablecoin denominated in your own currency. You're more comfortable with it, and there's lesser forex risk when you're on and off ramp from fiat to crypto. So to us, that really makes a lot of sense. And yeah, we'll be building use cases on this stablecoin. And we have really built up quite a bit of partnerships in this area, actually. So we are working with Blue Finance, Credix, a few in the real world asset lending space. Subera, which is doing subscription payments. Yeah, basically just trying to build up an ecosystem around the stablecoin so that there's more use cases for Blue SGD. And yeah, we'll also be doing more towards integrating services on top of the stablecoin towards next year. So look forward to that as well. We'll announce more towards a later date. But yeah, I hope that is informative enough for your
Thanks.
audience.
Look, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
And I guess that's what excites us, is that in the space, I think that, okay, US dollar, Bitcoin, and Ethereum are important, they're critical, but I think that over a longer time horizon, we're going to see decoupling of various asset classes from this peg to these instruments. And in case of LandX, I guess real farmland and real farmland derivative, they have intrinsic value that can be expressed in other ways, not necessarily in US dollars. Definitely, we're looking very closely at what you guys at Bluejay are doing. And then perhaps at some point in time in the future, when we're live, we can have a conversation about UX tokens as a collateral for the local currencies, especially if we can build a case where the local farmers could basically get access to local currency through this whole mechanism that we are providing. And that would be very interesting and very streamlined and very efficient. And it's really something that they would want to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for proposing that. And yeah, it makes sense for you and makes sense for us as well. As we build out more stablecoins in the region, we will definitely, we'll discuss further on for that. And yeah, thanks a lot for initiating this. And yeah, thanks again for your time.